Hi everyone, welcome to Art and Anxiety. Grab your favorite sedative, settle in, and watch me make stuff. Today I have a dirty little secret to share. I actually enjoy putting together pre-made dollhouse kits. I know, it's not something a miniaturist would admit to. But since I consider myself to be a maker and not a miniaturist, it's all good. The cool thing about making a kit is you don't have to think too hard about how am I going to make that chair or how should I wire that light. All of the heavy lifting is done for you. The bad thing about making a kit is when you're done, you end up with the same thing that literally thousands of other people have made. And who wants something so unoriginal? But for me, assembling a kit is really helpful when I'm going through periods where my anxiety is really bad. During those times, it can be hard to focus, and I get super frustrated when things don't go according to plan. So having the instructions for a project literally laid out in front of me helps me to focus on a task and not what's in my brain. I really don't want to end up with the same project that thousands of other people have made though. So I do tap into the reservoir of creativity that I'm saving to customize my kits and make them my own. Because I'm going through some life events right now that are extremely stressful and I expect to trigger full-on anxiety mode, I thought it might be fun to do a video series on how I customize my kits. So we're starting with this kit I bought off of Amazon that is a cute little half-scale coffee shop. And that's what you've been watching me inventory this whole time. You always want to make sure when you order a kit online that the first thing you do is check to make sure all of the parts are there. If they're not, send it back and get it replaced. The first steps in the instructions are how to build the base, which is perfect because the floor is usually the first thing that I customize. So the kit comes with these printed out sheets that you glue on for the flooring and some brick detailing on the foundation. Yeah, no, they're awful. We gotta fix that. The first thing I did is take measurements of the picture of the flooring. It's perfect to measure just that piece because they are printed to fit perfectly in the area that they need to go. So you can get all of your measurements from those printed pictures. Once I had all the measurements, I went to my computer and using Adobe Illustrator, I made a new graphic for the floor of my coffee shop. Now, I have a graphic design background, so I'm more comfortable using Illustrator or Photoshop to do these things than I am with just a pencil, but you don't have to do that. You can sketch something out, you can just take your measurements and start cutting. Do whatever works best for you. I am going to provide those files that I made for you for free download, just in case you want to work along with me on this project. Once I had remade the graphic, I sent it to my laser cutter and engraved it onto a sheet of mat board. Now, again, if you don't have the fancy tools, that's okay. You don't need them to do this technique. If you have a cutting machine, you can use the SVG file that I am providing and send it to your cutter. You're just trying to get through that top layer of mat board. You can also cut it by hand with a craft knife if you have the hands of a teenager and not arthritis like I do. I go the easy way because I have enough pain in my life. I don't need to add to it by hand cutting mat board for hours in a day. There are openings in the floor for wiring and an opening for the switch to the battery pack. You're going to want to cut out those openings with a craft knife, or in my case I used a Dremel, or whatever tool you prefer to drill holes through mat board. Once I had my holes drilled into the mat board, I taped off the area that I was going to be painting. Now, the picture that comes in the kit for the floor has two different flooring textures on it, and it separates the inside of the coffee shop with the outside patio where there's seating. And I kept it the way that the original picture was made because I did want to have that separation of spaces. So the graphic that I made for my laser is very similar to what comes with the kit. It's actually just sized down a little bit so that the scale is more appropriate for the scale of the project. Then I started painting the interior portion of the floor, and I decided to stay with a very similar color scheme to what is pictured with the kit because the wood comes pre-painted and I just didn't feel like spending hours repainting all these tiny little pieces of wood. So I base coated the floor with a sand colored paint, and then I sponged a vanilla color over the top of it to give it that mottled tile look. And then I went back and painted every other large tile with the forest green paint, which is the color of the flooring in the original kit. Hey, since you made it this far into my video, why don't you give it a thumbs up? It really helps my channel out. And as long as you're in the neighborhood, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I'm pretty awesome. At least that's what my mom tells me. And as long as you're there, hit the bell button to get notifications of when I post new content, which is currently Saturday mornings. Once I had all the green tiles painted, and I wasn't being very careful about painting in the lines, and I did go over onto the grout, and that's okay, and you'll see why. But once I got all of those painted, I just sponged a little bit of that first color that I used, that sand color, over the green to again give it that mottled tile texture. And then to finish the paint job on this portion of the floor, I went back and painted all of the little squares between the larger tile pieces with black. After the inner portion of the floor had dried, I peeled off the tape and retaped so that I could paint the outer portion, the brickwork, and not get it on my interior flooring. To start on the bricks, I base painted with Craft Smart chocolate brown acrylic paint, and I've said it before in other videos, this is probably my favorite brown to use because it does have a little tinge of red to it, so especially for things like brick, it really works well. I didn't worry too much about putting down a solid base coat, and I left it pretty streaky. And then for my next coat, I used a natural sponge to just sponge over some brick red paint. And after sponging on the brick red, I sponged another coat of that chocolate brown over the top to give it a really nice mottled variation in the bricks. Once the brickwork had dried, I very carefully peeled off my painter's tape, and you can see it did lift in a couple areas, but it was really easy to go back and just kind of dab in that color in those areas. I think they're mostly going to be covered by the walls, but just in case they're not, I wanted to make sure none of that white was showing through. Now, if you are the kind of person who likes peeling off your sunburn, you're gonna love this. This technique is based on Ira Bentley's conservatory floor tutorial, which I will link in the description box below, and definitely go watch it. She is an amazing miniaturist, and a lot of my things that I do are based on things I've learned from her. So what you're doing to get your grout lines back into this flooring is just picking off the top layer of mat board and peeling it. And if you go slow and are very gentle, sometimes you can get it off in a whole piece, and it's incredibly satisfying. But I'm telling you how weird I am, so let's pretend that never happened. This is why you can do this technique no matter what tools you have, because you're not cutting all the way through the mat board. Really, all you're doing is cutting through that very top layer of paper. So I did this with my laser cutter set on a really low power, just to engrave lines that go 1 or 2 layers deep into the mat board. You can do this on a cutting machine, a silhouette, or a maker with a blade, because you're not trying to cut through, you're just scoring it. You can do this with a craft knife if you have the patience, because you're not trying to cut all the way through. You're just cutting that top layer. Now, you might not be able to get as intricate of a design if you're doing it by hand, which is part of the reason I love to use my toys to do these things. But the end result is so cool. I mean, just look at that. Look at those grout lines. They're perfect. That's also why you didn't need to worry about painting very carefully, because you were peeling all that off. So if you slopped your paint on a bit, it just didn't matter. I really liked how the bright white grout lines looked, but they didn't look used. So to age it a bit, I went over it with a watered down burnt umber acrylic ink, but that looked really yellow. So in the end, I did another coat just using my regular black wash. For the finishing touch, I sealed the tile portion of the floor, the piece that's going to be inside the coffee shop, with polyacrylic. I didn't use my normal triple thick sealer because I thought that would be too glossy for a commercial space. I mean, think about it. If somebody slips on that on a snowy day, it's a lawsuit waiting to happen. So I went with a little bit toned down gloss, and that's what the polyacrylic does. Then for the brick portion, I used my ultra matte sealer, which has a little bit of shine, but not too much, and I think was just perfect for this portion of the floor. Next, I moved on to the brick foundation for the coffee shop, but to do that, I had to assemble the base first. That's really easy. The directions are in the kit. You just run some glue into the channel for the supports and stick it onto the floor piece. Then I used my 1-2-3 blocks just to keep everything square and held together while the glue on those 2 pieces took hold. Once the glue had set enough for me to be able to move the piece around without those sides falling off, I was able to glue on the front and back panels. And then again, I used my 1-2-3 blocks to hold everything in place and at correct 90-degree angles while the glue completely dried. While the glue was drying, I went ahead and started making the bricks for the foundation. Normally, when I'm making bricks or stone foundations, I like to use the paper egg carton material, but I was kind of worried that it was going to be too thick and bulky for this smaller scale project, so I went with a light chipboard instead, which basically is what cereal boxes are made out of, if you don't already know that. So I took my chipboard and base painted it with that same chocolate brown that I love so much, and then I got to work sponging it with different colors. The first layer of sponging was brick red, then I used an espresso brown over the top of it, and then I used gray, and then I went over it with sand before a final sponge of chocolate brown again. Now, to figure out what size my bricks need to be, I measured the bricks on the picture that they give you for the kit. These turned out to be a little big, but I rolled with it. If you're doing this, you might want to take like a millimeter or so off of each measurement and get bricks that are a tiny bit smaller. This next part is messy, but fun. So take a little bit of joint compound or spackle or whatever you want to call it and trowel it on to the sides of your coffee shop's foundation. And then just start laying in those bricks, giving them a good push down so that the spackle pushes around the edges of them a little bit, and build your wall. If you get spackle on your bricks, don't worry about it too much. While it's still wet, you can take a Q-tip dipped in a little bit of water and just wipe it right off. Once I had gotten all the bricks put into my foundation and the spackle had dried, I went over everything with 2 coats of black wash. And for that recipe, I will link to Black Magic Crafts video in the description box below. Once I had the brickwork all done, I noticed that there were some weird spots where the edge of the chipboard was showing along the edges, or some gapping along the corners of the foundation. So I decided that I wanted to frame everything out just to make it look more polished and finished. So to do that, I took some scrap mat board pieces and I left it white because I liked how it looked, but you could absolutely paint these. And I cut it down into 5mm strips. I cut some shorter ones and just overlapped them around the corners of the brickwork. Before I did the top pieces though, I made sure to glue the floor into place so that I didn't have any issues fitting it into the space later. And of course, when you're doing this, you're going to want to use your 1, 2, 3 blocks or a heavy book to make sure that the floor lays flat. I knew that the top piece of this framing was going to be the most visible piece, so I used my easy cutter to miter the corners. And it's really easy to do if you have an easy cutter. You just cut one side at a 45-degree angle and then lay it against your project and mark off where the other cut needs to go. Flip the angle around on your easy cutter and cut the second one. Do that for all the pieces, and I don't glue them in until I get them all cut to make sure that everything lines up perfectly, because mitered corners can be tricky sometimes. And then once you know that everything fits perfectly, go ahead and glue it in. Once I had the frame glued on, I went ahead and sealed the bricks. And of course, because I have to be different, for this one I used matte Mod Podge. The reason I went with the matte Mod Podge, even though it's a little shinier than the Ultra Matte and bricks aren't necessarily shiny, was because some of my bricks wanted to curl up along the edges because the spackle wasn't holding them down quite as firmly as I would have liked. So I thought the Mod Podge would just help seal everything together and push those corners back down. Are you ready for the big reveal? I just love how this turned out. I really do. And the biggest difference between what I made and what came in the kit is texture. Between the grout lines that we carved in the mat board, the different finishes between the inside and the outside of the cafe, it just adds so much texture, and texture adds dimension and realism to your projects. Now, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see the rest of this project as we go along, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Next time, I'm not sure what we're working on. I haven't looked that far ahead in the directions yet, but I'm sure it will be fun. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to get notifications when I upload new content. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Stay sane.